For the first idea of the first week, I decided to talk about the TED Talk video, How to Understand Power. I chose this idea because I believe that political science is built on the idea of power and who has it and who doesn't have it. In addition, power is recognized all over the world, not just in one or two countries, and therefore it's even more powerful because everyone recognizes it. Question 2, how does it connect with what we're learning in class? I think it's the basis and therefore is a really good introduction into this class. I think it gave me a really good insight of what political science is, other than just politics and presidential elections, which is kind of what I came into this class thinking about. So an example that you used that I'm gonna kind of steal from you was the hiking video. I believe it was a sign saying not to ride a bike on a walking trail, which I didn't fully understand was politics until I kind of went back and rewatched this video, because I understand now that it is a mixture, or what I think is a mixture of state action, state action and social norms. No one wants to be the jerk who messes up the trail, and so you don't ride the bike on the walking trail, even if you want to. But that in itself is power, so I thought that was a really good example. Power, to kind of answer your steps, power is related to what we are talking about for the rest of the week. We talk about freedom, order, and equality, and all of these things are, as we hear about in the video, power. Freedom is power of state, it's power of social norms, it's power of ideas, power of numbers. So is equality. It fits those exact same form of powers. So I think it directly correlates with what we've been talking about. And then finally, I guess it's not finally, I have 2 more questions. By the video explain, how did it expand your understanding? I think it completely shifted my understanding. Before, like I said before, I didn't really fully know that power could be taken in so many different ways. I figured it was kind of just, you do what I say, and either the person says, you know what, okay, or they don't. But now, from having watched this video, I understand that power is seen through physical force, wealth, state action, social norms, ideas, and numbers. It kind of makes me look back into the news and see events that are happening now or recently, and kind of evaluate what type of power those events were. For example, the terrorist attack at the Capitol, the nation's capital, I now look back and I can kind of see all forms of power in that attack. And let me explain that. So I think physical force was used. They stormed the Capitol. That's physical force in itself, and therefore power. Wealth. I think a lot of what Donald Trump ran on to become president was how successful he was as a businessman, and how money kind of made that possible for him. I don't know necessarily that he's the best businessman in the world. I think he was just really rich. State action, obviously Donald Trump was the president of the United States and kind of encouraged the events that took place. Social norms, even though in Denver it's not normal to think like a terrorist, I think that, having lived in Oklahoma, I know that a lot of people just kind of stay in their bubble and they don't see anything outside of their bubble, and it's really normal to be racist and awful and take things into your own hands, and I think that's a lot of what kind of happened. Ideas, same thing. They decided to storm the Capitol. And numbers, they had the numbers, they were able to break in, and the police couldn't do anything about it because they were, for some reason, unprepared. So The second idea in the first week that I'm choosing to talk about is the fragmentation page. It's a hilarious meme, and that is part of the reason that I chose to reread it. But it also is a topic that I don't think I knew a lot about. Before reading this article, I didn't even know what fragmentation meant. So that may be embarrassing as a freshman in college, but who knows. So that is why I chose the article. And I believe it connects what we are learning in class by explaining the basis of how the government is divided and how it works. In addition, I think that having just done a video about power is a really good lead-in to this entire class, because the branches are the way they are so that one branch doesn't have too much power. And I think it was a brilliant idea, and I can talk a little bit about if it has held up, which was the question at the end of your little insert. So but I think that the whole division of power is a really interesting thing, and I think it represents the United States really well, as we have not 3 but billions and billions of different groups in the United States, and we all have to work together in harmony in order to do things for the United States, like vote for the next president, or things in our community, like vote for the next governor, or even just things in the household, like deciding what you want for dinner. I think it's a great representation of how this country works, and I think it works for the most part. Sorry. It expanded my understanding by better explaining to me why the government is split up into the groups it is. I think your example of the high school groups is a really good way to explain it in layman's terms, because I think before I kind of understood that it was, we don't want a dictator, we don't want a king, a queen, we don't want any one person holding all the power. And with human nature, I imagine that was bound to happen unless we had some form of divided government. But I think it really gave me a better understanding of why things are the way they are, the purpose of it, and why it's a good thing. The third idea in the first week that I'm going to talk about is freedom and order. I am talking about this particular page because I think the idea of freedom and order is really interesting and important, especially with this last president we have. I think that freedom was a lot more important to his followers than order, and I hope that we have a lot more order within this presidency. And I don't think that will be a bad thing by any means. And that's kind of another reason why I chose it, because it immediately reflects on what we're learning about in class. Not only with the presidential elections, but freedom and order has to do with power, which is the basis of all political science, in my opinion. Having the power to decide what is order is by the power of numbers and power of people, social norms, voting for people to be in office, and then it directly correlates with state. This expanded my knowledge by showing that there are really 2 different ways to look at each argument. When you talk about gun control, having lived in a very gun-central part of the United States, I know guns are very important to people, and I don't fully understand why, as someone who thinks gun control is necessary. But gun control to them is restrictive and unfair and unconstitutional, as to me it gives me my rights because it allows me to go to school without worrying that I'm going to be shot and killed. So in addition, I think the whole freedom thing that a lot of, if we're sticking on gun control, people have is that them having a gun is what allows them freedom, whereas them having a gun is what also restricts me from being able to go on walks by myself at night or going down to 16th Street Mall with my girlfriends, you know? So I think it can really be taken both ways, and I don't think that point of view is seen a lot. I would like to continue learning about this area, especially because I have a love for arguing, which I know is not the idea of this page, but I like hearing the sides and the technical terms behind what each stance I'm taking is. I like knowing the difference between freedom and order, which I think sometimes can be a lot of times mixed up. So I'm excited to hear more. We are now in the first idea of the second week, and I'm going to talk about one explanation for how liberals and conservatives see the world. The TED Talk had a lot of really good information about what makes a liberal liberal and what makes a conservative, and it puts a lot of evidence, I guess, behind assumptions that I've made my entire life or things that I've seen and I've kind of made my mind up about things. So it's kind of interesting to now have actual data and information to back it up or to disprove it. But I really liked I think his name was Jonathan. Yes, his name was Jonathan Haidt. He had a lot of really cool information and he had a lot of cool comparisons, and I really liked what he had to say. I think the difference between liberals and conservatives is really important for us to know in this class, because I think it shows a lot of the differences we have in the United States and why we have those differences and why it's hard to kind of overcome such drilled in ideas in our head, because it's not necessarily something we can control. It's just something that shaped us as we grew up, and that's what made us a conservative or a liberal, and in how we were taught to react to certain things. And I think that's why it's so important that we learn about it, because it just shows the differences and how things could be solved, but they're not being solved. Let me go back to the questions. This expanded my understanding by proving or disproving a lot of assumptions I had made growing up. Having a lot of Republican friends, I think there's a lot of just fundamental differences of how we were raised, how we see the world, how we view things. And it's interesting to know that there's actual reasoning behind it now about how a lot of people just have a very small bubble that they stick with, and that can possibly lead them to thinking more conservatively and vice versa. So it just is really interesting to hear about these types of studies, as I don't think I've really ever heard anything like them before, and I don't see a lot of reasoning of why I'm this way or the other, except for where I grow up in, which I think a lot of people now, especially with this most recent presidency, are kind of breaking the mold. I know a lot of people who used to be Trumpies who are now not for Trump because of what they've seen, but they grew up liking Trump because their family liked Trump, and it's because of where they lived. So I don't know, it just adds a lot of great insight. What would you like to learn more? I would like to learn more about what makes us so different and how we can work together to overcome our differences in order to work together. I think it would be a really great problem solving idea, just to be able to sit down and talk about differences. And I think it'd be interesting to hear kind of what people have to say, and to hear more about the whole separation of just of moral differences. I believe we are now on the second idea of the second week, and I'm going to talk about why can't America be like Bud's Bar. The reason I chose to talk about this video and little article is because I think it's really interesting that a tiny little bar in the middle of Salida, Colorado, which for the most part is Republican, can separate their differences and talk about politics in a relaxed and calm way without conflict and confrontation. So I think it's really interesting, and I think it's cool to talk about. How does it connect to what we are learning in class? I think it's really interesting that a tiny little bar has a better understanding of differences of opinions than anywhere else in the United States. That this tiny little bar in the middle of nowhere can, just talk to people and not get upset about politics. And if they do get upset about politics, either put it on the back burner and just chat it up, or they can resolve their conflicts without it being aggressive or hateful. And I don't think we have a lot of that in the United States. So I think it kind of relates to what we're learning just by showing that it can happen. It can happen here in the United States. We just need a better system, probably. Maybe not a better system. We need better understanding of other people and more acceptance in the United States. 3, how did it expand your understanding? I think it was a really interesting thing to learn about, because it kind of just restores faith a little bit that these different people can come from different walks of life and still get along. So I think it just kind of gave me some hope, but also you can't read a book by its cover. And this video kind of affirms, or the video and article kind of affirms that, because you would traditionally think, oh, Salida, Colorado, everyone's just butting heads and arguing and whatnot, but it's really not like that, at least in Bud's Bar. So it was really interesting to hear about. And I don't know that I necessarily need to learn more about Bud's Bar in this class, but I would like to go there. I'd like to see the atmosphere and see what it's really like there, how people talk to each other. But related to the United States, I think it would be really interesting to learn about why people can't be more like the people that go to Bud's Bar. For the third idea for the second week, I am taking an idea from Why We're Polarized. This book is really interesting because it shows a lot of great perspectives from different people, and it shows a lot of great research and data that supports their claims, and it's really fun and interesting to read. In addition, it has a lot of good information just about how things happen, why they happen, how they can happen, and it is really cool to have that insight, whereas before, I think a lot of the stuff that particularly the election, I was shocked that it could happen. How did it happen? But hearing that it's not unheard of, it's not crazy that it went down the way it did, is really interesting to hear and read about. The quote that I am pulling from this book is, Trump showed us who he was gleefully, consistently. He mocked John McCain for being captured in Vietnam and suggested Ted Cruz's father had helped assassinate JFK. He bragged about the size of his private parts and mused that his whole life had been motivated by greed. He made no mystery of his bigotry or sexism. He called himself a genius while retweeting conspiracy theories in caps lock. The ability for the president, well, now not president, but the ability that Donald Trump was able to become president after talking about the size of his private parts, mocking a war hero for being captured, and bringing conspiracy theories to light that are dangerous for this country, let alone for him to have the power to do things with the conspiracy theories, is really insane. And to be shown that something like this is possible when the Electoral College was made for the prevention of someone like this taking power in office is hard to believe. And so it really shows that this country is not perfect by any means. We are far from it. And that even though the system is brilliant and at the time one of a kind, groundbreaking even, it does not work all the time. And I think that's really useful for this class, because I think we need to brainstorm, not necessarily new ways to run the country, but we need to brainstorm ways to fix broken systems and mend different people's perception of fellow Americans. So let me scroll down. How did it explain your understanding? It just really, it just shows that we as a country have a lot of flaws and loopholes, and that people don't care if someone has skeletons in their closet, and that they don't care if someone is crazy in the head if they like one thing that they say. It just really shows that we care about the wrong things in this country, and that it needs to be fixed. Otherwise, who knows what's going to happen. What would you like to learn more about? I think how Donald Trump was elected into office in 2016 is a good place to start. I still can't fully wrap my head around it, even though we hear a lot about it in this book and they explain why it's not crazy. It's just still hard to understand, but I would like to learn more about that. The first idea for the third week, I'm going to talk about divided powers from Ted Ed. This video is kind of about how the United States government is split into three branches, and why they are split into three branches, to make sure that not one branch has too much power. And I believe I've already done one video talking about this. I think it was in the first week, but it's really interesting to kind of further understand why we're split up as a government, and how each branch has different tasks and abilities and jobs. I also was always confused that Congress was the umbrella term in the legislation for senators and House of Representatives. So that was something I learned. But I'm glad I was able to get a better understanding of the different powers and what they do, and how they work together. Let's look at this expanded my understanding by explaining how the senators and House of Representatives work together even though they're different. And I learned a fun fact that the executive branch hires over 4 million people to get everything done, which is just insane. It's like all of Denver to get stuff done in the executive branch. So I thought that was really interesting, and it's cool that they all work together even though they're separate. Just kind of like the example of the high schoolers, which you were given earlier. I don't know that there's anything that I necessarily need to learn more that we're not going to talk about or have already talked about, but one question I have is, the judges are in service for the rest of their life or until they want to no longer continue. What if they are deemed unfit because of mental or physical issues as they get older? That's one question I would like to have answered, or I can research it or whatever. Yeah. The second idea of the third week that I'm going to talk about is Lesterland. I love the TED Talk videos, but this one in particular was hilarious. And I really liked the guy's example of all the Lesters voting. It was really interesting. And that's kind of the reason I picked it, just because it made me laugh, but it also had some really good points. It relates back to this class by explaining the way democracy works. That, thank God, not all of the Lesters vote, and that's what we get to vote off in the general election. But to an extent, I think that Lester, unless I completely missed this point, Lesters represent the rich who vote, and they have a large sum of power, even though they're just one person, and they vote and they take a part of the elections just like everyone else, but they have the power to get who they want in power by having money. So it was really interesting to kind of make that comparison and hear about what the guy had to say about Lesterland and why it doesn't work. Let's see what else I'm gonna send. How did it expand my understanding? By showing the way that the power is limited in Lesterland is a really good, the power of the people is limited, or they're limited in Lesterland. It kind of gives a good representation, I think, of how the power of the people are limited in United States of America land. And it shows some really good information and data about that. So it was really interesting to watch and listen to. And what would I like to learn more about? I would like to learn more about the idea of only the Lesters voting. I would like to learn more about only the rich being able to put certain people in power. I'd like to just learn more about why they have the power and the people don't. The final idea in the third week that I'm going to talk about is dividing the pie, the elite model. I'm choosing to talk about this article because the idea that the elite have most of the power is really interesting, but in addition it talks about the way that the wealth in Congress is not evenly distributed. That, and I'm looking at the example, it says the top 1% takes up nearly half of the Senate, and the bottom 80% takes up a tiny sliver, and the rest kind of fall in between, which are wealthy. So that's kind of why I picked it, and it's really interesting to just kind of see that a lot of the people making decisions for most of the United States don't know exactly what it's like to be most of the people in the United States. They have no idea what it's like to not have money, not have a ton of power. So that's why I chose it. Second question is, how does it connect to what we are learning about in class? It kind of goes off the whole Lesterland idea that the powerful in the elite have the power to make big decisions for this country. And so it talks about the elite model has two versions. The first version is elite theorists believe is a power broker rather than citizens who make the decisions on policy and hog the pie for themselves. The second one is, in the second version, is that educated elites are wiser and more tolerant and so should have more power. I think the interesting point of that is that the educated would make the decisions for the majority in the United States, which doesn't sound like a bad idea, but then I guess the decision is, how do you decide who's educated enough to make those decisions? By a test? But it's like, how are you gonna get everyone to participate? And then that just creates issues. So the power and money makes more sense, but it shouldn't be like that, and I think we all understand that. But it would be an interesting thought to have only the educated, to have only people that can pass a certain test or whatever be able to vote for people going into power in the United States. It's a really interesting concept, and I think that's what I'd like to learn more about. To answer the final question, I'd like to learn more about what it would be like to have only the elite, the educated, make the decisions for the United States. How did it expand your understanding? It just kind of clears up a lot of the questions you have about why the powerful have so much power, and why the powerful have so much power. That's because of money. Also because of education, which I think a lot of time comes from money. So it's really interesting. It's kind of like a cycle. If you're born wealthy, then you go to good schools, you get really smart, you have money to campaign, then you go into power. So it's really interesting to think about it like that.